So hello everyone and welcome. Today we are gathered for the Disability and Accessibility Resources panel. So this is our team, our DAR team. We call the Disability and Accessibility Resources team DAR, just for context. We have Jess Gibson and Maddie Wilson here to talk to you. And yeah, would you like to introduce yourselves?
That sounds great. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jess Gibson. I'm the Director of Disability and Accessibility Resources here at Reed. I'll hand it over to Maddie, and we'll give a slightly longer introduction when we start our presentation.
Hello, my name is Maddie Willon. I'm the Assistant Director over at Disability and Accessibility Resources.
Awesome, thank you so much. My name is Caitlin. I am an admission counselor here at Reed. My territories are New York, Ohio, and Illinois. So if you're coming from any of those areas, I am your counselor. I also was a student at Reed, and I'm just essentially here to moderate this panel today. How this session will work is essentially we're going to allow Maddie and Jess to give their presentation, and then we will save time at the end for a Q&A session. If you do come up with questions throughout the presentation, you can feel free to drop them in the chat, but we won't address them until later on after the presentations have concluded. So yes, I'm going to pass it on then to our lovely hosts.
Sounds good. And I'm going to do some screen sharing here. Let's see if I am successful. Have I been successful?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, welcome everyone. You figured it out by now, but you are at the presentation for Disability and Accessibility Resources here at Reed. Here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what is our office, what do we do, what kinds of accommodations does Reed offer. We'll just touch on the transition from high school to college. How do students get started with our accommodation process here at Reed? Perhaps questions about medical documentation and what we require, how do students interface with faculty, and a few other resources that we have available here at Reed for students. Um, for anyone who would like to turn on automated captions, you can do that. I believe that feature has been enabled. And as Caitlin mentioned, if anyone has general questions, we welcome those. Please drop them in the chat. We will likely address them at the end of the session, just because, there's a good chance we might address your question during the session. If you have any questions that are, I would say, generally applicable to most students, this is a great time to ask them. If you have a question that's maybe a little more individualized to your student, you're also welcome and invited to just schedule an appointment with us. We have a booking webpage where you can schedule a 30-minute just general information session where we could share some information about your student that might feel more comfortable to share in a more private setting. Okay, so who are we and what do we do? So there are three of us here in this office. Myself, Maddie, and Josanne Quitta. Josanne is our accommodations coordinator who works diligently to make sure that the accommodations that students are eligible for are actually put into place. I have been at Reed for 12 years now. Prior to this, I was working as a social worker here in Portland. I also have a background in residence life, so I am familiar with our housing situation here at Reed. Handy. And I'll let Maddie introduce yourself a little bit more.
Hello, again, my name is Maddie Willon. I'm the Assistant Director over at Reed. I meet with a fair amount of students for doing our intakes and help process accommodation requests. I have been at Reed for a little over 2 years now, I believe, and I have prior experience in special education and disability services since 2015. I've worked in a variety of different settings, both in school, clinical, and home. And I really enjoy working with students, getting to know them and getting them set up for, equitable access over at Reed.
Thank you, Maddie. So as Maddie mentioned, equal access, that is what we are here for, to ensure access. As you can see here on our slide, inclusion and access is what we are about. So folks ask us, are you student advocates? I would say it's most accurate to say that we are advocates for access, which often means we are advocates for students. But ultimately, our role is to ensure access for students here and inclusion. We want students to be able to participate as fully as possible, and have the chance to benefit as much as possible from what Reed has to offer. Students with disabilities at Reed. So at any given time, about 1/3 of our Reed student population is formally registered with our office as having a disability and requesting some type of accommodation, whether that's housing, academic, physical education. I share that just to say that I think sometimes folks come in a little nervous saying, is this a welcoming space for students with disability? Will faculty know what to do? And I'd say yes, there is a large degree of comfort and of sort of a spirit of being welcoming and inclusive here. The accommodation process. So who do we work with? What kinds of conditions qualify as a disability? Chances are, if you're here watching this webinar, you already know that your student probably has a qualifying condition. But just in case, we work with students who have any kind of medical or mental health condition that has an impact on a major life activity, and that results in some kind of access barrier for the student. Major life activities could include sleeping, learning, eating. Major condition impacting your access to read in some way. Not all students with disabilities need accommodations. So, that 1/3 number I mentioned, that's not every student who has a disability at Reed. There are some students at Reed who are not connected with our office for whatever reason. But of course, we are here for students who do need accommodations. Most commonly, I would say the students that we work with, we tend to work with a lot of students who have neurodevelopmental or neurocognitive conditions like autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, learning disabilities. We also work with students who have psychological disorders, mood disorders, depression, anxiety, chronic medical conditions, diabetes, GI conditions, migraines. Also students who might have sensory impairments, mobility conditions, visual or hearing disabilities. So a wide range. And what kinds of accommodations are available? We work with students on a really individualized basis. So even two students with the same condition might end up using different accommodations. You can see there from our graphic that we work with students around academic, housing, PE, or other. So for example, maybe some common academic accommodations might include testing accommodations for extra time or a reduced distraction testing space, perhaps some texts in an alternative or accessible format. For housing accommodations, sometimes students might request a single room or some kind of meal plan accommodation. So we do it all. Okay, I'm going to let Maddie take this one.
All right. I saw in the chat that I was a little quiet, so put my headset on. Is that better?
Oh, yes.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for the heads up. All right. So, how do we determine a student's eligibility for accommodations? So, as Jess mentioned, our process is very individualized. So, we work with the student
Sorry.
to, no worries. So we work with the student to understand the impact of their disability on their functioning and how that interacts with the educational environment specifically. And through our interactive process, through reviewing their intake form, their documentation, and meeting with them, we gain a better understanding of the access barriers they may experience as a result of those two interactions. And then we will work to determine if there is an accommodation that would be appropriate in effectively removing that access barrier for the student, so they can then have equitable access within the college environment. So an example of this assessment might be if we were to meet with a student who has a condition that impacts their reading and processing speed. We don't have a set list of accommodations that a student will qualify for just based on their diagnosis alone. So we'll work with them to just talk through, like, how do exams go for you? Get a better idea of how that, slower processing speed may manifest itself within particular contexts. And so with that example of exams under a limited amount of time, some students who experience reading challenges typically run out of time before they're able to fully read, comprehend the test content and then demonstrate their knowledge. And so in that example, the student might not have equal opportunity to fully show their content knowledge. And so in order to establish that opportunity, we would provide something like extended time on exams. It's also important to note that we approach our accommodations process in the spirit of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is about inclusion and ensuring that students have the same chance to do the things that their non-disabled peers are doing. So if a student comes to us asking to be exempt from something or permission not to fulfill a requirement through an accommodation, we would typically instead explore ways for them to fulfill that accommodation, maybe in a different way through accommodations, or pardon me, fulfill that requirement, maybe in a different way through the provision of accommodations. An example of that would be our PE program. At Reed, students are required to complete 6 units of PE. We've worked with students with a variety of disabilities and associated concerns of whether or not they'd be able to fulfill that. And we've worked with them to ensure that they can meet that requirement and participate in the amazing PE program that Reed has to offer.
All right.
Okay. And so we also wanted to highlight some of the differences in accommodations at the K through 12 setting versus the higher education setting. So in K through 12, accommodations are determined under the the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And in the higher ed setting, we operate under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504. And there are some key differences. And there's a few reasons for that. One difference is that at the K through 12 setting, the student may be identified by a teacher or a specialist as someone who would qualify or be eligible for accommodations, versus at the college setting, it's the student's responsibility to identify themselves as someone with a disability who's in need of accommodations. And it's their responsibility for initiating that process, contacting our office and starting that request process. Additionally, schools in the K through 12 setting may provide an assessment or documentation to establish the presence of a disability for a student and help them become eligible for accommodations. And at the college setting, it's the student's responsibility for having that assessment completed and providing us with documentation to support their accommodation request. Oftentimes, a copy of a student's IEP plan or 504 plan alone isn't sufficient to meet our documentation requirements, just given the level of information that we're usually looking for. That's not always the case, but we will also dive a bit deeper into what our documentation requirements are a little later on in this presentation. We also have success versus access within the K through 12 and college settings. So in the K through 12 settings with accommodations under IDEA, they may guarantee a level of academic success or comfort for a student. This could include modifying a course or even like a graduation requirement. And at the college level, under the ADA and Section 504, our focus is going to be on that equitable access piece, meaning accommodations don't necessarily guarantee a level of success in college, but they make sure that the student has the equitable opportunity to succeed and participate. An example of that would be that extended time on exams requirement. Simply receiving extended time isn't in and of itself going to guarantee that the student passes the exam. It's also going to be dependent on how prepared they are, how well they've studied beforehand, how familiar they are with the content. But it does provide them a fair opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge. Additionally, in college, we can't modify course for graduation requirements as an accommodation. So students will need to meet the learning outcomes and course requirements as their non-disabled peers. And lastly, we have IEP plans may include some scaffolding supports for students, such as a reduced reading requirement initially, and then building up to meeting a fuller requirement throughout the school year. But at the college level, we could provide an accommodation to help a student in meeting that requirement, like access to audiobooks or alternative format texts. But we can't reduce their individual course, like work requirement loads.
Yeah, and I think at the college level, thank you, Maddie, some of the supports that we provide are just general resources that any student could access that perhaps in the K-12 setting is identified as an accommodation, and that at Reed we simply offer as something that is a helpful resource for any student to use. So for example, if students might benefit from some individual tutoring in a particular subject or access to executive function coaching, those are things that any student at Reed can use here with or without accommodation. So it might have been built into an IEP or 504 plan. It's accessed a little bit differently at the college level. Some of what Maddie was sharing is also just to help prepare students for thinking a bit about their accommodations and knowing that sometimes students' accommodation plans will look very similar from what they used in high school to what they're using in college, but sometimes it may not be a complete match up. There are some accommodations, as Maddie mentioned, that are sort of more appropriate in the K through 12 setting that may not translate quite to the college setting. And so we would approach it a little bit differently. And I'll share a little bit more about that right now. So one thing we just want to acknowledge is that this is a big transition for your student, for you, for your family, and it's going to take some adjustment for everybody. Oftentimes we see, especially in the K-12 setting, that as parents, as caregivers, as family members, you have to advocate pretty strongly for your student to get access to what they need. You might be used to having to be sort of in this, mindset of like fighting for your student. You are their advocate, you have been their CEO, sometimes because that's the way that the system has been set up. And so we want to acknowledge that that's, a role that you've had to play to make sure that you are doing all the things that you want to do as the steward of the student. In college, once that student enters Reed, they become their own advocate and CEO, and sometimes it can take a little bit of time for students and families to adjust to that. So we hear from families who are saying, what can we do to help our students prepare for that transition? So here's just a list of ideas. I share this not so that it feels overwhelming. Please do not feel the need to address all of these things over the summer. But it might be a good idea to identify, what are the areas where, oh yeah, my student might use a little, they could benefit from a little bit of coaching or support in this area. Maybe we should talk through this before they get to college to help smooth out that transition. So some daily living tasks. Does your student feel confident or have a system for being able to get out of bed on time every day independently? Even for us adults, that can be hard sometimes. Do they know how to do their own laundry? Managing health and mental health. Do they know how to fill their prescriptions, use their health insurance? Do they have a system for remembering to take their medications every day? Do they know how to make appointments with their doctors or therapists? In the academic realm, do they have a system for keeping track of their assignments? In college, you're going to get several different syllabuses, each one with their own set of deadlines. Having a system for tracking that is helpful. Do they know how to use time management tools? Maybe a paper planner, maybe Google Calendar, whatever works best for your student. Normalizing asking for help. A lot of times students may have used accommodations in the high school setting, and maybe they're not sure if they want to or will need them at the college setting, and that is totally fine. Students can start their year here at Reed without using accommodations, change their mind later on, and connect with our office later in the semester if they'd like. But it might be good just for your student to have a sense of, how would they know that it might be time to ask for help? Whether it's asking, DAR or their professor or somebody else. Might be helpful to be thinking about some alternatives for accommodations that are specific to K-12. So as Maddie mentioned, anything that's a modification of a requirement, like reduced assignment load, having to complete fewer assignments or fewer readings, that's not something that would translate to the college setting. So what other resources or supports could be helpful for your student knowing that that transition's coming? The last one is helping your student be able to just understand and articulate their own condition and their disability and how it impacts them. Students have different levels of familiarity with their own diagnoses, IEP or 504 plans. And so one of the things that we will be asking them to do is being able to explain, this is my condition. This is how it shows up for me in the academic setting. These are the things that I have found helpful in the past. These are the accommodations I have found not so helpful in the past. So if you're able to kind of help your student think that through, that could certainly, I think, help them when they're starting to work with us through our accommodation process. Relationships, students will be navigating conversations with roommates. We do have resources at Reed for that as well if students run into difficulties with how to navigate that relationship. Sometimes some families choose to set up a communication plan for yourselves as a family. For example, student, if I text you, I will not worry if I don't hear from you for X amount of hours, but after a certain period of time, I will start to worry about you, so please text me back. Or some folks will choose to, connect on the phone every weekend or something. And then finances. Does your student know how to manage their budget, keep track of their board points, for example? So again, these are just, some things to think about over the summer as your student is preparing to come to Reed. Okay, accommodations themselves. So how do students actually get started in our process? As the advocate and CEO of their own academic experience here at Reed, our primary relationship here at DAR is with your student. So we will rely on them to share information with us about their conditions, what barriers they're encountering. I would say with that said, we do also we are available to help coach them and, sort of ask guiding questions because we understand that this might be the first time that the student is asking for accommodations independently. They will start by filling out a request form online. Let me see here. We do have an incoming student webpage. This is a screenshot of our incoming student webpage. You'll see there that there's a link to our academic request form and our housing accommodation request form. Those are two different forms. For students who are requesting housing accommodations only, they need to get that form to us by June 1st. For students who are requesting academic accommodations, they would need to get us their form by July 15th, and students who are requesting both will need to fill out both of those forms by those deadlines. I'm going to go back here. The forms are really also designed, one, they just help us get a little bit of, we start to get to know your student, get some information, but also it's a good way to help prep your student for the intake meeting itself. It encourages them to do a little bit of thinking of, yeah, how has this impacted me? What might I need? We will also be asking your student to submit some documentation to us. So this is documentation that has been prepared by a qualified medical or mental health provider. So for a GI condition, we would be looking for some documentation from their primary care provider or their GI specialist. For mental health conditions, we would likely be looking for documentation from a therapist. For learning disabilities, ADHD, autism, I would say often the documentation takes the form of a psychoeducational report or neuropsychological report. Not always, but I would say often. Some schools have pretty strict recency requirements. Let me see. Here we go. Yes. We don't have strict recency requirements, but I would say we do want the documentation to reflect the current level of functioning of the student. How does that condition currently show up for the student? How does it currently impact them in the academic or housing setting? So for example, if it's a condition, a reading disability that was diagnosed in fourth grade, and the impact of that has remained fairly static throughout their life, that documentation coupled with a 504 plan might be enough. Versus a student with a mental health condition, that can be a little more variable in its impact and how it shows up for the student. If that documentation is 10 years old, we would likely be asking for some more recent or updated documentation. Um, oh, can you pop the link in the chat? Maddie, would you be able to put our documentation guide? Thank you, Maddie. Yes, Maddie's going to put our documentation guidelines. Also, if you are on our incoming student webpage, there's a link to the documentation guidelines there as well. When students submit their accommodation request form, there is a spot there that allows them to upload their disability documentation at the same time. However, if you don't have your documentation, if your student doesn't have their documentation on hand right then, they can just email it to us or send it to us later on as well. That's fine. We do ask, though, that students please fill out an accommodation request form first before sending us any kind of documentation. And that is simply for logistical reasons. Filling out the form is what sort of creates a profile for a student and gives us a place to actually save their documentation. Otherwise, if you just send us their documentation, it will be in our email inbox, but it will not be attached to your student's profile in our system. And so just to make sure that nothing gets lost in the shuffle, please fill out the accommodation request form first and then send us your disability documentation. Going back to the documentation. We have our website there, and then on that website, we give some more detailed information about what needs to be included in the documentation. We also have on that website a form. It's an optional form that the provider can fill out, or we could receive a letter from the provider. It does not matter to us what format we receive the documentation in. I will say a lot of providers prefer the form just because that way they don't have to worry about keeping track of what was I supposed to write in this letter again. The form just asks for the same information that we would want to receive on a letter, but it just makes it easier for them to know, okay, this is the information that DAR is looking for. Generally speaking, we're just looking for, what is the condition? What are the symptoms? How frequently do we see these symptoms? What's the severity of them? How long do they last? How is this impacting the student's functioning? If it's for academics, in the academic setting, if it's for housing, how does it impact their housing needs? And ideally, what we're looking for is documentation that can help us connect the dots between the student's disability and the accommodation that they are asking for. Sometimes, for example, if I see, let's see here, a request that says, I have, diabetes, and I am requesting extended time on exams. At first glance, I might say, I don't see the connection there, but then perhaps the documentation shows me, due to changes in blood glucose levels, that can really impact the student's cognitive processing speeds, and their focus and attention. And even when they do stop for a snack, it takes some time before they're regulated again. And so in those settings, they might need some extra time. So again, we're just hoping that documentation can help us connect those dots. What about 504 IEP plans? I would say it depends. Some of them are super thorough and include the name of, the school psychologist or the person who did the assessment. They include diagnoses and dates of tests and evaluations and years of, accommodations. So in that case, yes, it might be sufficient. Some of them are like one page that just says, yes, the student qualified for services and doesn't give us a lot more information. So we'll just take a look at your student's situation holistically. We'll gather information from them. We'll gather information from, their documentation. And if we need more documentation, then we will let you, or not you, but we will let your student know. And then the third part of our process is a meeting. So this is where we get a chance to meet your student in person and start getting to know them. While they do fill out those, intake forms, we're not expecting them to go into a full history or full detail in those forms, and it's helpful for us to just hear directly from your student. What has their experience been? What have they found helpful or not helpful? What concerns do they have coming into college? What are they hopeful for? Students should be prepared to discuss how their disability impacts them. Um, Let me see. During that meeting, sometimes we are able to arrive at a finalized accommodation plan during that meeting itself, but I would say, I don't know, half the time we might say, great, thank you, and we might pause and we might consult as a team amongst ourselves. We might take a closer look at a student's documentation afterwards or consult with faculty just to say, hey, what resources are you already providing in this class? And so sometimes we might say, thank you so much, and we'll get back to you, maybe within a week to say, here's the accommodation plan that we're putting together for you here at Reed. And of course, it's a very interactive process. So we welcome students then telling us, yes, that sounds great. Or no, I'm concerned that won't meet my needs and here's why. Or, I'm not sure I need that accommodation now, but could I get back to you if I need it later? Yes, we absolutely have room for that, for students to start out the year and say, let's just see how it goes. And then, yep, I'm doing great. Or, turns out, yeah, I actually would benefit from that thing that I wasn't sure I needed. They can reconnect with us later in the semester. We're not able to put accommodations in place retroactively, but we could then put them in place from that point moving forward. When should students do their intake meeting? So we recommend, ideally, for academic accommodations, meeting with us by August 1st. That is a recommended date. The truth is, students can connect with us at any point in time and we will work with them then. But August 1st is our recommended date for students who are hoping to sort of have everything squared away before the semester starts, just because that gives us a little wiggle room in case maybe we do need to ask for some documentation or we do need to do some individualized look at, specific courses. But again, if don't worry too much if you don't meet that August 1st deadline. There are a couple of accommodations, such as captions or text in an alternative format. Those are accommodations that take us a little longer to coordinate on our end. So we do ask for students to meet with us as soon as possible if you know you will be using those accommodations in particular. Housing accommodations, there's no need to, if that's all a student's asking for and they don't need academic ones, then there's no need to proactively schedule an intake meeting. For that one, they can just start by submitting the request form, getting us their documentation, and then if needed, if we're like, maybe we need to understand a little bit more about what your needs are, or, what meal plan considerations we need to take into account, then we will invite the student to meet with us. Okay, and then after they meet with us and we have established what accommodations they're eligible for, what happens next? And I'll say this, this is particular to academic accommodations. The process for housing is similar, but we'll focus on academics here.
All right. Also, just wanted to point out that the deadline for submitting the housing accommodation request form and supporting documentation is June 1st. So as for housing. But with academics specifically, once we have completed a student's intake and established what accommodations they're eligible for, there are a few more next steps before their accommodations are set up and applied to their classes. So we have an online student portal where the students can log on and view their list of accommodations and current classes, and they can customize the requests depending on their specific needs in each course. And so that's nice because they can individualize it based on their needs. So they're not going to be forced to use extended time on all exams necessarily. They'll be able to have a bit more autonomy in where they want their accommodations to apply. So once they go through and select which accommodations they want to use in which course, the faculty are notified via email, and they are simply notified of the student's accommodations. It's a bit different than a 504 IEP plan that typically includes the student's specific diagnoses as well. We don't disclose any personal health information to faculty outside of our office. So the letter will simply say, "Dear professor, here are the accommodations this student is approved to use in your course." Um, that notification letter also provides lots of helpful information for both the faculty and the student around specific guidelines to follow for applying accommodations. So it's always a helpful reference for both the student and faculty to look over if they have any questions. Some accommodations require students to communicate with faculty, like coordinating logistics for testing accommodations. So once a student is approved for a testing accommodation, it is then the faculty's responsibility for coordinating that. DAR does not personally coordinate their test timing or location and things like that. So that communication and logistical planning will take place between the professor and the student. So when a faculty member has been notified of a student's accommodations, that student is CC'd on that email, so they're aware when faculty received that notification. And that's when it's a great opportunity for them to have a conversation about what these logistics will look like. That's a conversation about how it's going to apply in their class. It's not a conversation about whether the student needs accommodations or why they need accommodations. That's why they go through the entire intake process with us. So they don't need to disclose any personal health information to the faculty. It's just a conversation about how is this going to work in this specific course. About I believe 1/3 of Reed student population is registered with our office. So that means faculty are fairly familiar with the application of accommodations in their courses. So I don't anticipate that any large issues will come up for students, but if a professor has a question about how an accommodation specifically will work in their course, or a particular resource that might be available to the student through DAR, then we encourage students to reach out to us to let us know if their professor has a question, or the professor can reach out to us, and we are here to support them in the implementation process as well and answer any clarifying questions for either the student or the faculty.
Thank you. Okay. So outside of accommodations, what other resources do we have? Sometimes we find that a student does have a need for some kind of support, but that an accommodation might not be quite the best fit to address their needs. So we also are able to refer students and connect them with other helpful folks here at the college. So for example, if we have a student who is struggling with time management, perhaps they're feeling a little overwhelmed when they look at their to-do list, perhaps they don't have a to-do list, perhaps they're just focusing on those, weekly assignments, and they're really having a hard time getting started on the longer term projects, things like that. Then we can help connect that student. There's not necessarily an accommodation that can make deadlines go away, but we can connect them with some coaching, some one-on-one coaching through our academic support office, for example, or connect them with a writing tutor to help them, break down their writing project into smaller, more manageable pieces. If family members, faculty, if anyone has a concern about a student and says, I would really love, for someone from student life to please reach out to my student. I am worried about them. We have a care team here at Reed. If you are attending orientation in the fall, you and your student will learn more about the care team, what they do. But in general, it's nice to know, I think, that we do have a centralized way to say, hey, I'm worried about my student. Could you please check in with them? Our care team manager will then take a look at that and figure out what is the most appropriate support that we could offer that student. It might be an email check-in. It might be, oh, hey, you already have a relationship with that student. Could you see how they're doing? Helping to connect them with a particular resource. Here at Reed, we also have a health and counseling center that offers some basic medical services and a limited amount of mental health services. Our counseling staff are excellent, but I would say it does tend to be a little more sort of, short-term or solution-focused therapy. So some students, I think it's maybe six sessions per semester. Um, But I would say, for a lot of students, that is what they need to make sure that they are well and balanced. For some students, they benefit from having a more ongoing relationship with a therapist, longer term. Those students might choose to find a private therapist, in the Portland area. Um, we do also have a case manager at our health and counseling center who can help a student who's saying, hey, I'm seeking some services that the health and counseling center, maybe it's a bit outside of the scope of their practice, but I don't know how to find a local provider who's the right fit for me. If your student, isn't quite sure how to navigate their insurance or find a provider, we have a case manager at the HCC who can help them with that. Um, what else? Our HCC is what we call our Health and Counseling Center. They do also provide some prescriptions and medication management, depending on the prescription. I do believe that there are some prescriptions for which they have to have slightly more stringent parameters before they're able to prescribe it, namely some stimulants. I don't know exactly what their process is, but I would encourage you or your student to connect with them before arriving at Reed to find out whether they will be able to continue with that continuity of care and provide medication management for your student when they're here, just because I know there are some medications that cannot be prescribed across state lines. Let's see, what else? We have an Office for Institutional Diversity. We have a student engagement office for students who are looking to get involved in non-academic or extracurricular activities. We have a great athletics and outdoor recreation program. And again, we can help connect your students. So if your student's not quite sure where to go, but they're like, hey, Maddie was really helpful, they're welcome to connect with Maddie, and Maddie can, send a personalized email or help connect them with someone else who could be helpful. Okay, I think that is what we have so far for our formal prepared content. Hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully we've answered a lot of your questions, but we absolutely welcome, as I mentioned, any general questions about our process. Feel free to drop those in the chat. And then any sort of more questions that are specific to your student, you're welcome to schedule an appointment with us or send us an email.
Thank you so much, Jess and Maddie. Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. Very comprehensive. So yes, if any of you all do have questions, you can absolutely pop them in the chat. There's also a Q&A function if you want to submit questions through that. I do know we have a couple that have already popped up. So do we want to dive into
Oh, there
those
we
now?
are. Perfect.
Awesome.
Okay, so one of the questions is sort of the types of conditions that might qualify for a single room. And then another question is about bringing a support animal. Okay, so I'll start with that one. If they're hoping to bring an emotional support animal, will they be limited to a specific residence hall? No. Emotional support animals are able to live in any residence hall on campus. Would ADHD qualify for a single room? I would say we generally don't look at it as, does this condition qualify for this accommodation? We approach it more from the lens of, what's the particular access barrier that the student is experiencing? And is that something that we could, is a single room the only way to achieve that, or are there other resources that we could offer? So with ADHD, for example, if a student says, I need a quiet space to study, that in and of itself may not rise to the level of requiring a single room because we have other quiet study spaces on campus that we can offer students. But for example, if that was coupled with, a sleeping disorder or something where we're starting to see kind of a more, the presence of a roommate having a more significant impact on a student's functioning, then we might start to look at an accommodation such as a single room. I say that in a very generalized fashion, but we would work in a really individualized manner with your student to take a look at what is their condition or conditions, how does that impact their housing needs?
I know we also, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead,
No,
Jess.
no.
I was just going to say I saw a question in the chat more specifically about the actual process of bringing an emotional support animal to campus.
Okay. Basically, same process as our general accommodation process. So students would need to, so if you're going to bring, request to bring an emotional support animal, you would fill out a housing accommodation request form. The student would then also provide some kind of documentation from a mental health therapist, again, helping us connect the dots to what's the condition, why is this requested, or just, certifying that there is a qualifying disability, and, that the relationship with the animal is helping to mitigate, the impact or the symptoms in some way. Um, Sometimes that's sufficient. Sometimes we also ask the student to meet with us. And then if it's approved, the student does also have to sign just an agreement, sort of stating that they are the ones who will, be responsible for the care of the animal, that they have a backup plan for the care of the animal, that they agree to have the animal, comply with our county, licensing, pet requirements and things like that. Let me see, I'm gonna read here. So if a student is transferring from another college and they have accommodations that were provided by that college, are there any processes we need to follow? And second, is the recorded presentation going to be available? Yes, the recorded presentation will be available. And then, is the process different if you're a transfer student? I would say no, same process. If students have had an established accommodation plan from another school, they're also welcome to just send us information about, here's the accommodations I used at that school. Sometimes they'll end up with the same accommodations here at Reed. Although sometimes we might end up with a slightly different accommodation plan. Maybe the types of courses that we offer here at Reed are, the student might have different needs. Maybe the student said, actually, that one accommodation I never really used. So we'll just take it all into account. But we will still ask students to go through just our usual process. Thank you for the list of life skills. How far along with those skills would you say a student should be in order to be successful at Reed versus taking a gap year? I know. I had some hesitation about sharing that list because I thought I don't want parents to look at this and think, oh no, my student's not ready. Because students arrive, at all different degrees of readiness. And, maybe they get here and they don't know how to do their laundry, but guess what? They figure it out, right? So, I think I shared that more as like, oh yeah, there's maybe this one area where it would be really good for us to, maybe take an intentional closer look at that. And then there's some stuff where we just know, like, this is how we learn and grow as humans, right? This is how we have to trust that our students are going to be growing and developing. And I would say, like, you probably know your student better than anyone else. Maybe that list could be a helpful tool for the two of you to sit down and look at it together and say, what do you think? Does this timing feel right for you? Does this timing feel right for us as a family? So I know that's not very helpful. Um, but I would say you and your student are probably the experts on that. Um, Anything else? Let's see.
I believe that's all the questions for now, but
Okay.
we still have some time. So if anyone has any more, please feel free to drop them in the chat.
And you're always welcome to email us afterwards as well.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you all. I know that we have not been able to interact with you personally, but we will be interacting with your students personally, and we look forward to working with them when they arrive here this fall.
Yes, thank you so much to Jess and Maddie, and honestly, everyone involved with DAR just for helping to give this presentation today and inform everyone on what your division is able to provide for students. Yes, thank you everyone for coming. We hope to see you at future virtual sessions. As Jess said, you can always email DAR if you have any specific questions. And yes, just thank you so much for being here today. We will be posting this video to our YouTube channel, so you can find it there in the future. Yes, thank you all so much for coming and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.